Well, good morning. Is this working? Is this on? Good. Can you guys hear me good? Sweet. Awesome. Hey, well, good morning, guys. I am excited to be here with you guys. If we haven't had the chance to meet, my name is Johnny, and I'm on staff here in Wildlife. If it's your first time joining us this morning, big special welcome to you. What we're about to do is we're about to go into a time we like to call a time of teaching. You see, in Wildlife, we love to play crazy games and to shoot the impossible shot and do all that awesome stuff in worship. But really, why we gather every single Saturday night or Sunday morning is to come here and learn about more about who is Jesus and what he is calling us to. You see, we're starting a brand new series this morning called Wisdom. And as you see in the title, it's spelled WISDUMB. And we're going to talk about a little bit what that means later on. Couple things as we head into this time. You should have had a note sheet in front of you as you guys walked in. So if you don't have one, go and grab one. They look just like this. This is a great way to follow along in this time. Now, I want to let you guys know, especially if it's your first time joining us this weekend, this is not a test. It's not a quiz. This isn't designed to trick you or anything like that. This is a great tool to help you follow along and hopefully remember some things that hopefully stand out to you or even something that confuses you. So go ahead and pull those out. This is a great tool. It's also a great way if your parents are like, hey, what did you learn or what did you talk about at Wildlife? Instead of just like staring at them with like a blank stare, like you know what that looks like, right? Kind of just like you ask them, they ask you a question, and you're like, yeah, Taco Bell. And they're like, that's not what I asked you at all. This is just a great way, hopefully, that you can then share something with your parents about what you learned, all right? As we head into this time, this is also not an opportunity. It's not a chance to be a distraction to the people around you. So what I mean by that, this is not a time to be talking to your neighbor, to lighting your friend's chair on fire, something like that. This is a time, some of you just looked at me like, what? This is a true opportunity for us to learn something new about Jesus. So with that, we're going to go ahead and pray, and we're going to invite Jesus into this space. So let's go ahead and pray. Jesus, thank you so much for this morning. We're excited. Again, we see these sixth graders here, and man, I'm just so excited for where you are taking Wildlife this summer. We're excited as we begin this brand new series. Would you help us understand more of what it means to have wisdom? Not just our wisdom, but ultimately your wisdom. Your way is always better. So this morning, would you help us understand what that means, what that looks like? And it's in your name. We all said, amen. Wildlife, I want to start out this time with asking you guys a question. Is that okay? I'm going to ask you guys a question. This is a rhetorical question, which means you don't have to raise your hand to answer it. I want you guys just to think about it in your head. Now, here's the question. Have you ever had a friend who loved to give advice, but they were not qualified at all to give the advice? I think for some of us in this room, we can all think of a friend. Have you ever had a friend that would give you advice, but the reality is that they were nowhere near qualified to give that advice? I know I have so many friends that oftentimes they would give me advice, and I'm like, how do you have any qualification to give me advice on that specific topic, for example? Now, I heard recently, I was reading this article, and I'm not going to like name drop this person, so we're just going to call them Bob. Everyone say Bob. I read recently this guy, Bob, was giving his friend dating advice. Now, all of us just went, ooh, and all the sixth graders are like, what's that? What is that? Now, I'm going to give you guys a heads up real quickly. What I'm about to share with you is the worst advice, especially when it comes to dating. You see, this guy, Bob, was giving his friend advice on how to date someone. Now, here is some of the advice. Again, here's the thing about Bob, though. He could not get any relationship to work for himself. So this advice is terrible advice. If I did any of this with my wife, that would not be a good thing, right? So here is some of the terrible advice. He said, Bob, don't be too nice too often, or she will always expect you to be that way. Terrible advice, right? All the ladies were like, Yeah, I want to punch him in the face, right? Here's some more advice. Um, Bob would only take his girlfriend on cheap dates so that then they would not know how much money he actually has. Terrible advice. Another one is that he would never compliment his girlfriend because he believes then you might convince her that she is out of your league. Terrible advice, right? Now, guys, I want to remind you for a second that is terrible advice. Don't go up to your crush and be like, man, you're ugly. I don't want to give you. No, that's terrible advice. Also, don't date till you're like 40, all right? So, anyway, the reason I share that is because oftentimes, am I 40? Wow, thanks. I feel 50,000 years old. Doesn't mean I'm 40. Anyway, we're getting off topic. The reason I share that is that oftentimes the advice that we give to other people, sometimes we're not even qualified to give the advice, but oftentimes we think our wisdom is true wisdom. You see, Bob, he had good intentions giving this advice, right? Terrible advice. You can never get a relationship to work for himself, but this is terrible advice. It's not true wisdom, it's actually very dumb wisdom. You see, we're starting this series called Wisdom, and we're going to be looking at what true wisdom is. Now, before we kind of go deep dive into the passage this morning, I want to take a brief moment and help us understand what wisdom is. You see, I think some of us think wisdom is someone who is very smart. But I know a lot of smart people that are not very wise at all. You see, wisdom is not being smart. It's not just being smart. Wisdom is living smart. Wisdom is living smart. It's knowing how to live. That's what wisdom is. So, what we're going to be looking at in this series over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at biblical wisdom in comparison to worldly wisdom. You see, the Bible is full of wisdom, full of so much wisdom that God has revealed to all of us. But the reality is that some of us confuse worldly wisdom with biblical wisdom. And we get confused and we think our way is better. You see, biblical wisdom simply says this: it's showing how to live your life based on how then you honor God, living your life so that you honor Jesus. Worldly wisdom teaches you live your life so that you are happy. Worldly wisdom is all about yourself, where biblical wisdom is your life being lived so that then you honor God in how you live your life. In First Corinthians chapter 1, we're not going to dive deep into that right now, but what Paul writes to this church in Corinth is that he says that God is not impressed with worldly wisdom. He's not impressed with impressing people with worldly wisdom. Now, for example, for most of us in this room, especially if you've gone to RPK, you've been at Wildlife for a while now, you know that if you were to look at how God saves all of us, right? We know that God saves us through Jesus. And the way Jesus saves us is that he lived the perfect life and he died all the death that we deserve so that we could be made new and have life in relationship with Jesus forever, which is awesome. But what's crazy from the world's perspective, that's bonkers. It's weird to think that Jesus, the Savior of the world, God in the flesh, would come and die. To the world, that doesn't make sense, right? A good story, the hero doesn't die, but that's God's story. But we see then Jesus was raised to life. So to the world, that doesn't make any sense. That's not wisdom. But what we'll see today is that oftentimes God's wisdom is often the opposite of our wisdom. What we think is right, what we think is good, is words, or is usually the opposite of our wisdom. So on your note sheet, there is a couple of fill-ins. So I need you to do me a favor. Your first fill-in in Proverbs 23:23, it says this: truth, this is your first fill-in on the screen. Truth, get real wisdom and never let it go. Get real wisdom and never let it go. Now, you see, real wisdom, once you have it, the Bible teaches don't ever walk away from it. Once you experience and have true wisdom, biblical wisdom, you will then begin to understand fake wisdom in how you live your life. Because once you know truth and once you know real wisdom, you'll see fake wisdom and you're going to like, no, that's not true wisdom. So what we're going to be looking at in this series is we're going to be contrasting God's wisdom to worldly wisdom, which is truly just dumb stuff. So, what we're going to be looking at is that God is going to be calling us to live our lives a certain way, and that begins with understanding His wisdom. So, throughout this series, over the next 4 weeks, we're going to be looking at different books of the Bible known as wisdom literature or wisdom books. And we're going to be seeing that the Bible is full of wisdom that God has revealed to us. So this weekend, we're going to be looking at the book of Proverbs. Now, Proverbs is designed in a way that it's not like a narrative, like a story. Like if you were to ever read the book of Genesis or the book of Exodus, you would see that those have stories or a narrative throughout it, telling a story. Proverbs is revealing to us different wisdom that God is showing us. So here's something you need to know about what we're going to be looking at. Your next fill-in, wisdom, with a D-U-M-B, is this. Wisdom means just follow your heart. But wisdom, God's wisdom, is follow God. So worldly wisdom, follow your heart. Do what makes you happy. But biblical wisdom is follow your heart. Now, for example, follow God. Worldly wisdom, follow your heart, is all over Disney, right? If you've ever seen a Disney movie before, like Cinderella or something, I think there's like a song in Cinderella 2, if you've ever seen it. There's like a song called Follow Your Heart. Here's the thing about your heart. The Bible describes it this way. Not Proverbs, Jeremiah 17:9, it says this on your note sheet: the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? You see, oftentimes when we're like, I'm going to follow my heart, what makes me feel good, what makes me happy, I'm going to follow that. But the Bible shares like, hey, actually, your heart is lying to you. The word deceitful just means lying, a liar. Now, for example, for some of us in this room, we often get tricked by our hearts, by what we feel often, and it kind of leads us on the wrong path. Now, for example, maybe you can relate with me on this. My heart often longs for food. I love food. Now, for some of us in this room, maybe when you think of food, food is like so good, like a Chick-fil-A sandwich, a little bit of barbecue sauce, maybe a little bit of honey mustard. No, I know it's closed. I'm sorry. Go to Raising Cane's. It's better. But when we think of food, oftentimes when maybe for me, I'm sad, I will be like, you know what? Bag of chips seem pretty good right now. That's comfort food, right? Or when I'm happy, I'm like, I'm going to celebrate with some chips or some pizza or something like that. Or even maybe when I'm bored, I want to just start eating because that's what my heart long for. But here's the reality: is oftentimes our hearts lead us astray. Again, our hearts, the Bible describes our hearts as deceitful. So, worldly wisdom teaches us to follow our heart, what makes you happy. But biblical wisdom, God's wisdom, says, no, follow God. So, what we're going to be looking at this morning, we're going to be looking at a passage in Proverbs. So, on your note sheet, towards the bottom, we're going to be in Proverbs chapter 3, starting at verse 5. Now, we're going to be looking at a different translation of the Bible than we're used to in Wildlife. Typically, we read through the NIV translation. But this morning, we're going to be looking, and in this series, we're going to be looking at a translation known as the New Living Translation, the NLT translation. Now, what you need to know is that the Bible, every translation is saying the same thing, just in a different way. Maybe it chooses a different word to describe something, but it's all saying the same thing. So, in Proverbs chapter 3, it says this: trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Then you will have healing for your body and strength for your bones. Now, what I want to do is I want to unpack a couple of these verses to help us understand more of like what's going on here. So, on your note sheet, follow along with me. We're going to be looking at verses 5 and 6 real quickly. And if you have a pen with you, I'm going to ask you to underline a couple of phrases or a couple of words so that our minds can focus a little bit better. So in verse 5, it says, trust in the Lord. Underline that phrase, trust in the Lord. Now, what I love about these two verses, and I think all of us can agree with, most people will agree with, is like, oh, if you trust God with your life, you will be on the right path. That sounds great, right? But then you look a couple of words later and it says, with all your heart. Underline that, those three words, all your heart. Now I read that and I go, whoa, 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 what's all of this heart business, right? Because what we just learned is that our hearts are often deceitful. So what's going on here is that oftentimes when our hearts are longing for something that's not God, our hearts are often lying to us, and it's a really tough situation to be in. But if you trust God, which we'll talk about a little bit later what that looks like, you will then be on the right path. Now, verse 7, follow along with me. It says, don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Underline that phrase. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Now, for me, I read that and I go, what? Like, I think I'm pretty wise sometimes. I think maybe some of the advice I give is pretty good sometimes, but it keeps going. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. You see, oftentimes what we think is wise, what we think is good, is often not wise and not good. Here's a question, again, a rhetorical question. Just think about it in your head. How do you make decisions? How do you make decisions? Do you make decisions based off how you feel? Do you make decisions based off of what feels good, what looks good? But oftentimes, what we need to understand is that the decisions we make are not always the best. They might be good in the moment. They might be good for a couple hours, couple weeks, and then something happens and your whole world just blows up and you're like, oh no, everything is crumbling, everything is going away. But this next phrase in this verse, in verse 7, it says, fear the Lord. Now, for some of us in this room, we hear that and we go, fear the Lord? I'm supposed to fear God? Yeah. But it's not in the same way that I think most of us think of fear. Like you should be terrified, scared out of your mind. But fear the Lord simply just means this: to be in awe of who God is. Another way of saying that is like, wow, God, you are God and I'm not. That's being in awe of Jesus, being in awe of God. Now, this last verse, it talks about, hey, if you trust God, you go on the right path, and you're not impressed with your wisdom, if you fear God, it says this in verse 8, then you will have healing for your body and strength for your bones. I love this. Basically, what it's talking about is that if you trust in Jesus, you trust God and his wisdom, even when it doesn't make any sense, even when you can't see the next step forward, you can trust God because then you will have healing for your body and strength for your bones. You see, in the New Testament, the second half of the Bible, it talks about how Jesus is the bread of life. He is the living water. And when you go to Jesus, he's going to give you exactly what you need. Now, catch that, what you need, not what you want. Oftentimes, what you want is really not what you need. Like maybe some of us in this room, if we were honest, we'd be like, man, I really need a new PlayStation, or I really need a new iPhone, or for some of you are like, man, I need a new friend. That's another topic. Um, but oftentimes, what we think we need is not really what we need. See, Jesus knows exactly what you need. And he promises that when we trust in him and we walk in his way, in his wisdom, he will lead us on the right path. It's not always going to be easy, but it's going to be good because God is there with us. Now, with the rest of the time that we have, I want to walk us through 3 action steps. So, on the back of your note sheet, follow along with me. How are we going to get wisdom and never let it go, right? That's what we're talking about this morning. How can we get wisdom and never let it go? 3 action steps. Number 1, write this down. Here it is. Be careful to be wise, not unwise. Be careful to be wise, not unwise. Proverbs 14:16 says this: the wise are cautious and avoid danger. Fools plunge ahead with reckless confidence. Wise people slow down and are cautious. They avoid danger. People that are unwise, they just run headfirst into crazy situations without thinking about it. Oftentimes, when we run into situations, we don't think about the consequence. We just go, hey, no, this feels good right now, or this looks good right now, but we don't think ahead. Wise people stop and think, and super wise people stop and pray and ask Jesus, hey, is this a wise thing to do? Now, if you want to be careful and to be wise and not unwise, I would encourage you, maybe starting today, there's 31 chapters in the book of Proverbs. Maybe for you, hey, ladies in the front, maybe for you, it's just reading a chapter a day for the entire month. Now, you're going to have to read a chapter or so. It doesn't line up exactly. But maybe for you, that's a great way to get real wisdom and just start underlining and drawing boxes around words and start asking questions to your leaders. That is a great way to get wisdom and to be careful to not be unwise. Now, here's the second point. Trust God even when it makes sense to be afraid. Trust God even when it makes so much more sense to be afraid. Let me be honest with you. It's sometimes hard to trust God. It's hard sometimes to trust that God's way is better. But I'm here to tell you today is that God's way is always better. It will always be better, even when it makes way more sense to be afraid. You can trust God because he is good. In Proverbs 133, it basically talks about that those who trust in God will have peace and they will not be afraid. Here's your your third fill-in. When God and my heart disagree, trust God. When it makes way more sense to follow your heart and it doesn't really align with what God says, trust God. Like what we were talking about in this series, God's way is always better. It's sometimes harder, but it's always better. And let me tell you guys this, for every 6th, 7th, and 8th grader in this room, your way is not the best way to live. When you follow God and you trust in Jesus, you will be on the right path. And you're not on the path alone. He's right there next to you. When you're on the path and something happens, you're like, wait, Jesus, I was trusting you. This doesn't make any sense. This seems really hard and challenging. He's not like off on the sidelines, kind of just like, whoop, figure it out. No, he's right next to you, where you can go up and ask Jesus, like, Jesus, this doesn't make any sense. It makes way more sense to be afraid. And my heart's kind of disagreeing with what you're saying. You can be honest with Jesus because 1, he already knows, but 2, he wants us to be honest with him. So when your heart disagrees with God and the Bible, trust in God. It's so awesome that we have so many great leaders and we have so many awesome new leaders here in wildlife. And oftentimes when we trust in God, it is so challenging, but it's going to be always better than anything you could possibly imagine. I've been a Christian for a good while now, and every opportunity I have to follow my own path and I take it, it never works out. It may work out for a little bit, but it always ends in destruction. But every time I follow God and I trust in Jesus, man, sometimes it's challenging, but it always is better because God is there and he's going to help me through it and he's going to help you through it as well. Like maybe for you, a new sixth grader, you are going to a brand new school this fall, and that's terrifying to you. You're like, man, middle school? Oh my gosh, that's terrifying. Or maybe you're here this morning and it's your first time and you're like, oh man, this is terrifying. I am scared. I don't know anyone. Maybe it makes more sense to be afraid right now. But you can trust in Jesus because he is so much better. Like I often have heard this phrase, like when Jesus brings you to a moment in your life and it's really challenging, really hard, but if he brought you to it, he's then going to get you through that situation. It can be challenging, but Jesus is always better. And all the leaders that we have, if there's something going on in your life like, man, this is hard, this is a tough situation, you can easily just grab a leader and just be honest with them. So as the band comes up, we're going to go into one last song of worship. But I want to leave you guys with this. I'm going to read the passage one last time, Proverbs 3. And I want you guys to do me a favor. And I want you guys just to close your eyes where you guys are at so you're not distracted by the people around you. And I want you just to listen to what the Bible is saying. So go ahead and just close your eyes and just listen to what the Bible says. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take. Don't be impressed with your own wisdom. Instead, fear the Lord and turn away from evil. Then you will have healing for your body and strength for your bones. So Jesus, we do come before you and we're so grateful, Jesus, that you're here with us. Even when life gets scary, even when it makes so much more sense to be afraid, man, we can trust you because you are good, you are for us, and you are not against us. Jesus, as we go into this last song of worship, would you really speak to us through this song? Would we all understand more of how your wisdom is so much better than our wisdom? That your way is always better than our way, even when it makes more sense to be afraid, even when our way seems to be making more sense, would we trust in your way of living? Because your way is life-giving. And it's in your name. We all said, amen. Hey, I'm going to invite you guys to stand on up. And we're going to go into one last song of worship.